Like I was describing earlier, we've been talking in our notes about God's attribute of incorporeality, or God's not being or not having a body. So in our survey of the scriptural data concerning God's incorporeality, we saw that God is a spirit, that God is omnipresent, which entails that God is also a non-physical being. We saw that God is invisible through the scriptures, and that images of God as corporeal objects, like just any sort of art, even in the Sistine Chapel, this sort of thing is forbidden to portray God in a bodily form, because this takes away from God His immanence and His the fullness of God is sort of diminished in these art pieces, and so it's forbidden to do this sort of thing. And so we saw in the scriptures that these images of God are forbidden. And so all these ways the Bible goes to affirm that God is a non-physical being. He's not a material or a physical object. Nevertheless, we also saw that the scriptures are filled with human-like descriptions of God. God is frequently described in bodily terms. The scriptures speak of God's arms, His hands, His eyes, His ears, and so forth. And these are pervasive in Scripture. It's not simply that these bodily parts are attributed to God, but even activities like God seeing the distress of His people, hearing the cry of the people, these are sort of anthropomorphisms of God. And so an anthropomorphism, we're going to use that term a couple times today, is just to say that it's human-like. And so these descriptions of God in these bodily terms are anthropomorphic descriptions because God doesn't literally have eyes that are receiving photons, and He's able to process that information. He doesn't have physical ears where sound waves are bouncing in off the eardrum and that sort of thing. And so the scriptures, though, are replete with these descriptions of God in bodily terms. And this is what we saw last time. To have a more in-depth view of these scriptures, listen to the class or read the notes from last week. But so today what we're going to do is try to make sense of this. How do we make sense of the fact that the scriptures say God is an immaterial, spiritual being, but also they give these very physicalistic descriptions of God in these very graphic bodily terms? We saw to Moses, God was saying, "You can't see my face, no man can see my face," and so He turned His back to Moses. And so these bodily descriptions are puzzling. So today we want to try to make sense of it. And then also we saw that sometimes people have visions of God which are corporeal in nature. And so they'll see visions of God as a body, maybe sitting on a throne or something. And so this is another thing that we're trying to make sense of. So we've got scriptural data on the one hand that clearly implies that God is a spiritual being, an incorporeal being. Yet you also have these corporeal descriptions of God in the Bible, these bodily descriptions. And then you also have the visionary experiences of God as a physical being, maybe sitting on a throne, like I said. So the question is, how should we make sense of this? How should we come to understand what the Bible is trying to say about God in virtue of His physical makeup? Does He have a physical body? In light of the scriptures, in light of God's property of being omnipresent, how can a physical being also be omnipresent, present everywhere, fully present everywhere? It would seem that if God was a physical being, He would be in one place. Or if God was throughout the entire universe as a physical being, we'd have a part of God in this room, a larger part in the impact center, a larger part in the sanctuary. It's like, but that doesn't really make sense. We don't want to say that we have a part of God, a smaller part of God here. We want to say that God is fully present everywhere. And so that entails that God is not a physical being. And so we want to make sense of the scriptural data, though. This is the conflict, is that we have the scriptural data that describes God. It's primarily in the Old Testament. Describes God as this physical, bodily being. And so I think that the data that we surveyed demand that we think of God as incorporeal, as immaterial, as non-physical. And there's simply no way of getting around this. there are very clear passages that indicate that God transcends matter and energy, and so has created all physical reality outside of himself. And so that would also imply that he is not a physical being. If he created all physical matter, all physical creation, then he himself cannot be physical. He would have to create himself, and that's impossible. No one can create themselves, right? Not even God. That's logically impossible. It just doesn't even make sense. And so how can we understand these terms, these scriptures that describe God as physical, and also these theophanies, which are again, this word just means a vision of God. These people that had visions of God as a bodily person. How can we make sense of this? And so I would say that these corporeal descriptions of God, and this is what we're going to use as the solution today, these corporeal descriptions are metaphors. They are metaphors. They are not literal. They are not meant to be taken literally, but there still is spiritual truth there to be had. And so I'll give two reasons in support of this interpretation. So these descriptions serve a clear literary purpose. These descriptions as God in a bodily form or in bodily terms, they serve a clear literary purpose. So, for example, when the scriptures speak of the arm of the Lord, they are talking about God's power. When they speak of God's eyes, they're talking about God's being all-knowing. When the scriptures speak of God's ears, it is talking about his attentiveness to certain persons. All of these corporeal descriptions have a literary purpose. You can also interpret it in a different sense. And so in the New Dictionary Bible, there's an article on the word face. And this is especially well described in this article. This is how the New Bible Dictionary treats the term face when it is ascribed to God. It says, the Hebrew word is used in many English senses. The face of a person became synonymous with his presence. The face of a person became synonymous with his presence in ancient Hebrew times. So it didn't necessarily mean the physical face when it said God's face. It meant that person's presence was there. The nose, the lips, the eyes. Rather, it became synonymous with that person's presence. And so, metaphorically, determination could be shown by setting one's face. Determined opposition was made by withstanding someone to his face. These are these phrases here. Withstanding someone to his face just meant determined opposition. Right, and this is how to make sense of this term. Intimacy and understanding was conveyed by the phrase face to face. Right, when you're standing face to face with someone, that's meaning something else. It's not meaning that you're necessarily standing face to face. It's that you're being intimate with that person. And this phrase has, of course, it's stayed with us, and we even say that today. And there's also the expression "his face fell." Have you ever heard that phrase been used? His face fell. And so obviously these expressions are not meant to be understood literally. It's not that someone's face fell off, right? There's something else going on here. It would be inept almost to think that when someone says his face fell, that his face dropped to the ground, right? Rather, it expressed being disheartened or disappointed in something when someone's face fell. That's what it actually means, right? And so that's a metaphor for saying that this person is disheartened or disappointed. The Unger's Bible Dictionary also says, with respect to God's face, applied to God, it denotes his presence. And such phrases as seeing the face of the Lord, or the face of the Lord is set against them that do evil, or their cry came before the face of the Lord, it is evidently all one with God's manifested presence. And so God's presence is what's being described here, not a physical face. So a correct reading of the scriptures to understand these expressions, I think, makes clear their literary purpose, right? So when we see God's face being described, it's actually describing God's presence being there, God's manifest presence. And a good example of this is in 1 Peter 3 and verse 12. 1 Peter 3 and verse 12. It says, the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those that do evil. I'm going to read that again. The eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. but the face of the Lord is against those that do evil. And so clearly I think it would be ridiculous to interpret this passage as when it says the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, that God has like physical eyeballs sitting on top of the righteous's head, right? That doesn't make any sense. So we want to interpret this passage metaphorically. We want to understand this as saying that these are figures of speech, right? So the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous. That just means that he's watching over them. He's taking care of them, making sure nothing is going to happen to them. And when it says his ears are open to their prayer, that just means that he takes into account their prayers, right? When they pray, that he knew what they were going to pray, and so he set up the world in that way. And then when it says the face of the Lord is against those that do evil, when we equate face to presence, we see that that means that God's presence, his manifest presence, is not necessarily with those that do evil, right? And that makes perfect sense when we think about hell. Hell is a sort of separation from God, and so his presence, his face, is not there. And so to move on, the second reason I think we should understand these expressions to be metaphorical is that if you do take them literally, then that would be very inconsistent with everything else that we know about God, pretty much. Because God is differently described in these other passages, as we saw with respect to omnipresence, right? That would conflict there. And so what we want to do is make sense of all of this and not have these contradictions in Scripture. And so what we want to do is find a way to make sense of this. And the metaphorical interpretation makes perfect sense, right? And we just saw this, that God's face is not necessarily trying to say that God's physical face is there with this person. It just means that his presence is there. And so we could also ask the question, if we do take these passages literally, then where is God? If God is a physical body, where is he? According to the Scriptures, God fills both heaven and earth. Therefore, he actually cannot be in any physical place. He cannot be somewhere. He cannot have a physical body if he's going to be everywhere all at once. And so therefore I think it's obvious that we should understand these descriptions of God, these anthropomorphic descriptions, in a metaphorical way rather than a literal way. And this is the way that we should understand these passages that seem to describe God's face, his eyes, his ears, and that sort of thing. So what about these theophanies, these people that supposedly have seen God in these visions, right? What should we make of this data? So I think we should understand these theophanies to be mental projections of the percipient's mind. It's not as though he's seeing something external to his mind. Rather, God, in giving him a vision, is sort of teaching him something through this vision. He's teaching him to learn something about God, about the supernatural realm or something. He's teaching him through this vision that that he gives him, but it's happening in this person's mind. It's not happening externally to his mind, right? That wouldn't make sense. And we're going to see why this is a proper interpretation. We're going to look at 3 different theophanies described in Acts. And so visions like these are very, very common in the Bible. People had visions of God pretty much all the time. And so let's look at 3, like I said, in the book of Acts to see a few different examples of this. First in Acts 10 through 16. Acts 10 through 16. And this is Peter's vision of a sheet, almost like a sheet being lowered from heaven that is filled with all various kinds of animals. This is a really, for lack of a better term, this is a very weird vision. Acts 10 through 16. And he became hungry and wanted something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance and saw the heavens opened and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its 4 corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. And so this is a vision that Peter had. And so here I think it's very evident that this is not there wasn't a literal sheet be lowered down from heaven, right? This is something that he experienced in his mind. There wasn't some external sheet with animals and stuff in the sheet being lowered and everything 3 times. This was something that happened in his mind, and this was something that God was teaching him. He wanted to teach him something. And it says in, I think it's verse 11, that Peter he was in a trance. And so I don't think that we should think that, again, this is describing some tarp that's being lowered down with all these unclean and clean animals. This is a mental projection that God caused Peter to have to teach him a lesson about clean and unclean, preparing him for proclaiming the gospel to Cornelius and his household, who would be regarded as unclean because they were not Jewish people, they were Gentiles. And so therefore, they weren't necessarily worthy to receive the gospel if we understand that they were eating these unclean animals. And so God is giving him this vision to prepare for his proclamation to the gospel of the Gentiles, saying that what I have called clean, you cannot call unclean or common. And so that's the whole point of this vision, is that God was teaching him something through this, to say that he's made everything clean. And so therefore you can go and preach the gospel to these Gentiles. And now let's turn back to Acts 7. Acts 7:55 through 57. Acts 7:55 through 57. This is Stephen's vision of the exalted Christ of the Son of Man at his stoning, when Stephen was stoned. It says in Acts 7:55, "But he, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And he said, 'Behold, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God.' But they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and rushed together at him." And then he was stoned. And again, this is a purely private vision that Stephen alone had. It wasn't that all these people saw the heavens open and then Jesus was at the right hand of God. This is something that Stephen had personally. And so if he had it personally, then it was a mental projection that he had in his mind. And so the people standing around him saw nothing, right? That's not what is described here. Stephen had this himself. And so its non-literal nature is also evident in the sense that he sees the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God, which is itself an anthropomorphic description of God that serves a literary purpose. This is why this vision is not counted among the resurrection appearances of Christ. This was not a resurrection appearance story. And you guys know what the resurrection appearance stories are, right? This is where Christ appeared to these people after he died. After he was resurrected, he appeared to several people, right? He appeared to Paul, he appeared to the 12 disciples, and this is described in the gospel. And so these are Christophanies. These are actual physical appearances of Christ to these people. And so this vision that Stephen had is not like this, right? He had a vision of Christ sitting next to God in the throne room. But so this is a visual projection in Stephen's mind. It's not that Christ physically came and appeared, right? This is a vision. And so another example is in the book of Acts. It was still in the book of Acts. It comes in chapter 16. Acts 16, 9 through 10. Acts 16, 9 through 10. And this is Paul's famous Macedonian call to come and preach the gospel in Macedonia. And it says in Acts 16 and verse 9, "And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, 'Come over to Macedonia and help us.' And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought out to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them." And so here again, God causes Paul to have this vision of a man in Macedonia, inviting them to come and preach the gospel there. So this is a visionary seeing. It even says it's a vision. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. And so this is something that was very private with Paul. It was something that God gave Paul. And we shouldn't understand this as thinking that there was some physical person there that was calling Paul, "Hey, come visit me." It was a vision that Paul had, and this served a purpose, right? It served the purpose of calling Paul and calling the disciples to come preach in Macedonia. And so then I lied. We have 4 different examples. So the last example is in Acts 22, 17 through 18. Like I said, there's a lot of these different visions, and so we can it's nice that we can draw from so many and help to understand what these theophanies really are. They're visionary experiences. Acts 22:17 through 18. Acts 22:17 through 18. And so here Paul is recounting his experience of coming to faith in Christ. And so after his baptism, he says in Acts 22:17, "When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, 'Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me.'" And so here Paul again is entranced. He's in an entranced state. And he had a vision of Jesus wanting him to get out of the city. This is not a resurrection appearance, right? We're not saying that, this isn't saying that Christ again came in physical bodily form and was appearing to Paul and telling him these things like we had in the appearances early on when Christ was resurrected. This is a vision of Jesus, right? This is not a bodily, corporeal appearance of Christ. This is an entranced vision of Christ, which Paul had, that serves the purpose of warning him to get out of Jerusalem. And so these kinds of visions are well known, like I said, in the Bible. And when we read these stories of theophanies, of seeing God, these are visionary experiences, mental projections on the part of the recipient that God causes them to have in order to teach them some significant lesson. These theophanies serve the purpose of manifesting God's glory, or making God's glory real for that person. And we're going to look at just a couple more examples. So back to Exodus 33 and verse 18. This is the story we read in our last session of Moses asking God to see God, and God granting him a sort of diminished version of God's glory and goodness. And so in Exodus 33 and verse 18, Moses said, "Please show me your glory." And then God said, "I will do so, but you shall not see my face. You will only see my back." And so God gives him a diminished vision of the glory of God, but this serves the purpose of manifesting God's glory and goodness to Moses. This is the reason for this vision, is that it was serving this purpose of manifesting God's glory to Moses, so that Moses could understand the fullness of God's glory, the fullness of God's goodness. And so compare what the author of the book of Hebrews says about Moses' experience in Hebrews 11:27. Speaking of Moses, it says, "By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible." And I'll read that last part. "For he endured as seeing him who is invisible." So God is invisible. The author of Hebrews affirms it. He's not a visible person. He cannot be seen. But Moses endured as seeing him who is invisible. So this is saying he had a vision of God because God is invisible. And so the purpose still of this vision was to show Moses the glory of God, the goodness of God, right? This is the purpose of this vision, is that he could see God's, and it was a diminished, if he was to see God's full glory and his full goodness, then it says in Exodus that he would have died. And so God gave him a diminished vision. But through this vision, he was strengthened and therefore was able to endure as though he had seen God himself, who cannot be seen because he is invisible. And so another example would be in Isaiah 6:1 through 3, where Isaiah sees God and his glory in the temple. Isaiah 6:1 through 3. It says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory.'" And so here again, God's holiness is manifested in this corporeal vision of God upon a throne that Isaiah receives. Right? And so this vision serves a purpose. It's a manifestation of God's holiness that then causes Isaiah to feel conviction of his own sin and inadequacy. And so this one was again a vision that Isaiah had of God sitting upon a throne.
I have a comment. I think that in the way I'm seeing things, that it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. I mean, I'm still thinking that wherever the disciples Moses are at this time, whatever dimension that they are at this time, could God be in his corporeal form, but on earth he is incorporeal? So I'm thinking that could he still have both, right?
Okay.
Could he still be both?
Mm-hmm.
So wherever they are at this present time, he's in that bodily form, but on earth he's in the spirit form. That's how he's able to appear to us
Okay.
all the time. Two, as a spirit, could he have shown his bodily form in that shape, but he's still a spirit? So
Okay.
if God says you can only see my back, well, he probably had his illusion or just the shape of a spirit where you saw God, but not the actual body. So as he walked by Moses, you actually saw the shape of God as a spirit. See, I'm trying to incorporate. It's hard for me to see these things as always separate.
Okay.
I'm always trying to look at these things that how can it be the same? Why can't it be both?
Right.
Because that's where we're trying to exceed our understanding, trying to get to a place where not everything is black and white.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? And I also believe what you spoke about, metaphorically speaking, sometimes that's the case as well.
Right.
So why can't it be all three? Who's to say it's one or the other or the other?
Okay. So the question is sort of why can't God be a physical in a corporeal form in heaven, right? And then a non-corporeal form in the earth?
Right.
Okay. Well, God, it says in the scriptures, God fills both heaven and earth. And so he would fill both. And so it's not, well, I mean, that would seem that he was existing almost in two different places. That just, I mean, when I'm thinking about this, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And so another thing to go back to is that no object can have two contrary properties. Nothing can be A and not A at the same time. And so that would mean that God is both a corporeal and a non-corporeal being at the same time. And that's a contradiction. That's a logical impossibility. Nothing can be that. Nothing can be both in this place and not in this place at the same time. Right? That just doesn't make any sense. That's just almost a limitation of our language. It's the result of our language that we can't even make sense of that sentence. How can I be both in this room and not in this room at the same time?
I don't know why, but it seems like I actually understand that about God more than it's either or though. I actually understand that more, that he can be here and not here. I can actually understand that more versus us saying it could only be here or there.
So there are theologians.
So there are restrictions.
So let me go back a step. And so this is actually going to relate to God's omnipotence, which is God's power. And so we're going to talk about this in a few weeks. We're going to talk about God's omnipotence. There are theologians who think that God can perform the logically impossible. They believe that God can make it the case that God exists, and God can also make it the case that God does not exist. And so there are theologians that take that. But once you jump into that, once you accept that, all sorts of absurdities start to arise. How can God make it the case that both evil exists and evil does not exist? How can God make it the case that God exists? How can he make it the case that simultaneously God does not exist? But this is possible if you take the view that God can perform the logically impossible. And so once you take this view, though, it just becomes, all these absurdities start to arise, and it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And you're welcome to take that view. I personally don't find it palatable. And so I want to say that God cannot perform what is logically impossible. That just doesn't make any sense. That's a restriction of primarily of our language. And so when we do that, we want to say that God cannot be both A and not A, because that's a logical contradiction. It violates the law of identity. You can't have both properties at once. Or not the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction. That's a logical principle. you can't have both A and not A. That's the law of non-contradiction. And so, but if God can do that, then God can perform logical impossibilities, and that leads to all sorts of absurdities. It's a very, very minority position in Christianity today. So he can't
in the bodily form and in the spirit.
So he
form
could be.
at the same time,
He could. What he could do is be a physical body, then become a non-physical body, and then he could become a physical body. But he can't be both at the same time, because that's a contradiction that we're seeing here. And so if you want to take that view, you're welcome to. I personally try to avoid that. I've thought about, when I came upon it, I was like, maybe God is in omnipotence. Maybe that means that God can perform the logical impossible. But that all these absurdities start to arise. It just doesn't make any sense. I can't make sense of it. And there's no reason to go that far. There's no reason to do that, right? Because we have these descriptions and we see that they make sense metaphorically, right? And so when it says that God's face was there, that means that God's presence was there. And when he was watching people, he was ensuring that their travels were okay and all that sort of thing. And so there's another meaning that's there, but it doesn't need to be taken literally. And then we saw in the New Testament when it said that the eyes of God are on the righteous. That doesn't make any sense to think that God has eyeballs sitting on top of the righteous, right? We want to understand these passages metaphorically. And so there's no need to jump to that sort of radical idea of God's omnipotence, that he can make logical impossibilities the case, right? There's no need to go that far, I don't think. And if you do that, then, you can affirm whatever you want to affirm, because God can perform, whatever. He can make it the case that you exist and that you don't exist at the same time. Stuff like that. It's just all this stuff just starts to compile together.
And the thing that goes back just real quick
go ahead.
To the point is that when you research the scriptures and do the word, there's confusion. Confusion is not of God, so you study and get clarification through the scriptures, and that breaks the barrier of going this way or that way.
Right. Did that answer the question?
Yes.
I hope that's at least a start in the right direction, as to understand, which view do you find more correct, I suppose. Do you think that God can perform logical impossibilities, or do you think that that's just more of a restriction of our language that doesn't make any sense, and there's all these absurdities that arise? And so if you want to reject that view, then you want to say that God can perform what is consistent, what is logically possible. And so God cannot violate the law of non-contradiction. He can't make it the case that both A and not A at the same time, because that's a logical contradiction. And that doesn't take away from God's omnipotence, because that's just an impossibility. That's like there's these objections to omnipotence that go, can God create a rock so heavy that he can't lift it? This is it's called an omnipotence paradox. And a lot of atheists will want to say this. But once we understand that God cannot perform logical impossibilities, then we say that no, God can't perform that. But that doesn't mean that God is limited in his omnipotence, because God cannot perform logical impossibilities. God can't logically make it the case that he can create a rock so heavy that he can't lift it, right? That just doesn't make any sense. And so that's one answer to these omnipotence paradoxes, is that when we say that God can't perform logical impossibilities, then we understand that these omnipotence paradoxes fade away. They just completely dissipate. But on the other hand, if you think that God can perform the logically impossible, then he could perform a rock so heavy that he couldn't lift it, because that's logically impossible, right? So,
but I think the other thing may be and sometimes it's hard to not get bogged down into what is, I guess, a logical impossibility, because what we may consider to be a logical impossibility really isn't.
okay.
Versus...
So a logical impossibility is something that violates a logical principle. And so there's the law of identity, is that everything that is true of A, if it's true of B, then A equals B. And so if there's something, let me go away from that one. The law of non-contradiction is much easier. And so you can see that it can't be both the case that A and not A. That's just the pure law of contradiction. And so if something violates that, then we see that that's a logical impossibility. That's a logical contradiction. And like the example that I gave here in the room, so I can't make it the case that I'm both here and I'm not here, right? That just doesn't. That's a contradiction. I can't be both the greatest tennis player in the world and not the greatest tennis player in the world.
See, I think that doesn't and the way I see it doesn't really hold true to what I was saying, because you would have to compare God's body being here and not here. I'm talking about God's body and his spirit being at the same time. So A and not A would be God's body here, and then it's not here. It doesn't make sense. God's spirit is here, but it's not here. It doesn't make any sense. I'm saying the both of them together. God is wherever he is at this point, but his spirit is all with us at the same time. So the A, not A, it doesn't hold true to this situation, because we talk about two different things and not the same thing.
Okay, so God's physical body, and you're saying that in the same way that we have a soul, that's God's spirit, it's everywhere, and then God's physical body.
God could be in heaven, wherever that dimension is right now with Moses, wherever they are.
So he wouldn't have. So he wouldn't be
right now.
So he wouldn't be similar to us in the sense that our souls do not extend beyond our bodies, right? My soul is not outside of my fingers. It's not over here somewhere. It's in my body, right? But if we understand this idea of God, then it would be that. Except when you die, that's another question altogether. But so God, in your sense, would be a sort of, his spirit would be everywhere, and then he'd have a physical body, some specific place.
They are at this time.
See, we still run into a contradiction there. So when we ask where is God, you would say he's here because his spirit is here, but then he's also over there because his physical body is over there. So he's both here and not here.
No, that's not true.
Well, his physical body would be over here,
right? So
but his spiritual body would be here.
Right, but then you have to say that. So you have to say, okay, it's his spirit that's here, but his physical body's over there. But you can't say he's here and he's not here. It depends what you're talking about.
Okay.
So sorry.
No, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Sorry. I'm actually running late for choir.
Yeah.
What he brought to my mind is the Trinity. Because why did he have to take on this form if he could be both the physical body and the spirit man? So when he was saying that over here in my head, I was going, okay, well then Jesus, when he came down and took on this physical body, then where was that need?
Okay, so again, we need to remember that Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, he took on a human nature. And so he had two different natures. He was a fully divine being and he was a fully human being. And so that human nature includes a physical body. And so God was related to the human nature when he became incarnate at the time of the incarnation, when he, back in the ancient times. And so he took on that human nature, but he was still completely God. He's both completely God, completely man. And so the part that is physical on this understanding is the human nature side of it, right? And so there's the physical, or the divine nature, and then the human nature. And so that's why we can say that Jesus was physical in the sense that his human nature was physical. It was his human nature that died on the cross. It wasn't his divine nature that died, right? The divine nature was still there. It's the human nature that died on the cross. I didn't get to finish my talk here, but so just to summarize real quickly, is that we saw that there's this option of interpreting these passages as being metaphorical, completely metaphorical. When it talks about God's face, it's talking about his presence. And when we see that God talks about eyes being on someone, that just means that God is sort of watching over them, making sure that they're not defended, but protected on their travels and that kind of thing. And so there's this option of interpreting these passages metaphorically. That also makes sense of God's omnipresence. How can God be everywhere? It would seem, though, that if God is a physical being, he's got to be located in one physical position, right? And so, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because then we'd have a part of God in this place and then a part of God here. But in the scriptures, we understood that God is fully present everywhere. And so that seems to come in conflict. And so when we understand these passages metaphorically, that makes sense of God's incorporeality. He's not a physical being. And then we also saw that these theophanies, these visions of God, are meant to be thought of as visions in the person who has them, right? It's not that everyone was seeing this physical appearance of Christ or something. It's that this person was having this vision, and it was for a purpose. It was for in the case of Moses, it was that God was teaching him about his manifest glory and his goodness. And God was showing Moses how good God is and how glorious he is. And that helped him endure through the trials that he faced when he went back to Egypt. And so these visions serve a very clear purpose when it's in the mind of the person that has them. And so we don't need to understand these visions as being something physical, of actual God being there physically. So we can understand that as something that's happening in the mind of the person. And so that's one way that we can resolve these conflicts. Conroy brought up an interesting solution himself, is that God is it's a difficult view to understand, I think, on the face of it, is that God is he's spiritually everywhere, but then his physical body is in heaven. I don't know really how to make sense of that. But I think that and he'll probably want to object when he's listening on this. But I think the proper understanding and the clearest understanding is that these passages are metaphorical. When they talk of God's face, his eyes, his feet, his breathing, his nostrils, these are metaphorical. They mean something else. There's a purpose there for it. And then these visions are visions. They're visions in the person that's having them. They're something that's happening in the mind. And that doesn't take away from anything. It just means that God is giving them this vision that he's having for a purpose, to teach him about God's glory, about his goodness, or some other purpose, right? And so that's, I think, the way to understand God's incorporeality. So, do we have any other questions or discussion for the last couple minutes?
I just want on the first one. It says 1 John. Is it 1 John or just John?
It might just be John. I might have written that down wrong, because I have first and then I have one, so it's probably just John. Any other comment or question? We're still understanding that incorporeality means not having a physical body, right?
When you think about it, like Ruby, one of the things that popped up in my head too was the Trinities. And when you start to talk about it, which is like the whole purpose of the class, it does make you think a different way as to how you see it. I mean, I feel, and I think all of us at some point has had a vision that incorporated God. And from that vision, there was, like you said, there was a purpose, especially when you think about something that God instructed you to do.
Right.
There was somebody there. You don't know who. You know who it is, but at the same time, you don't know who. But if you've gotten an instruction from God, then you know that you possibly didn't see a physical body, but there was some form of a presence there, right, that just moved you to do what it was that he instructed. There was a
very specific purpose that God was doing there, and he was giving you either a vision, could have been a dream that you had that helped propel you to do something that God may have wanted you to do. And so there are these very specific purposes that these visions, the reason why God gives us visions. So we're out of time. I'll go ahead and close in prayer. God, we thank you for today. We thank you for another day that we could come together and discuss more your properties and what you are, who you are, and how you are. And we thank you for this opportunity that we have here. Not everyone has this opportunity to come together and to discuss these things in such a deep level. I mean, not everyone even has a Bible that they can look at, much less access to the internet to where they can research these things. And so we thank you for this opportunity that we have to come together. We don't take it lightly. And so we thank you for that. We thank you for today. Thank you for Cammie's birthday yesterday. It was beautiful. It was perfect. Brittany did such a great job. Thank you for such an awesome wife. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen.